Welcome to Fix It Home Improvement, covering projects that every homeowner should know and great products for home and garden.
Hi, I'm JC, and this is where we share weekly home improvement tips. I'm here with my co-host Cindy.
Hello, JC.
Hi, Cindy. Today we have some tips for kitchen backsplashes, and we'd like to thank Slew Pilot for liking and sharing the podcast. The ancient Egyptians were using ceramic tile around 4000 BC, and they were all individually handmade and hand-painted.
Well, they're not mass-producing them, like in a factory.
Right, and that didn't happen. The mass production didn't happen until the Victorian age, around the 1830s.
Right.
Primarily, the colors in the 1800s, they liked green, brown, red, and blue.
Okay.
That's primarily what they were mass producing. And then subway tiles, usually that 3x6 rectangular shape.
Right.
That was developed for the New York subway in 1904. And they used white so it would reflect the light, since they're underground, and be easy to clean. For a kitchen backsplash, you can
Are you going to explain what a backsplash is?
So the area above your counter, well, on your drywall. Rather than having just painted drywall, you can put tile there, and that's going to prevent splashes like from your stove. If you're cooking pasta, it's going to be very easy to clean.
Right, so it's above your sink.
Right, and you can do just one area. So you can do a little grouping just above the sink or above your stove, or you can do the whole area above the countertop. And
so like from the counter to the cabinets?
To the upper cabinet, right. And then some designs are going to have a unique group of tiles, so like a focal point, like in the center of your counter, let's say your sink is there or your stove, and then you might have different colored or different style of tile the rest of the way. So it is just amazing,
I think they
the
should
variety.
Make it look like a window.
Right.
Like you're looking outside when you're doing the...
That's what the Egyptians used to do. But if you go and Google kitchen backsplashes, just images, or go to Pinterest, and it is amazing the variety of tiles and the different designs that you can do.
It seems like a lot of work and really easy to mess up, I think.
Right, yeah, some of these are pretty complex. And some of them, they'll take one style tile and then they'll cut like the corners off, and they'll inlay, either small glass tiles or, little decorative pieces. It is pretty amazing. So if you look at some of these images first before you go to the store, you might get some really unique ideas. Mm-hmm. Ceramic tile is one of the most popular choices for a kitchen backsplash. This is going to come in a wide range of colors and shapes and textures. You can get them just plain. You can get painted designs, or they're actually made to look like wood or stone.
Right, yeah, this is pretty cool.
And most of the ceramics are going to be very easy to clean. They're affordable. And with the glazed styles, they're going to have a very hard, scratch-resistant surface and very easy to cut with a tile cutter, a wet saw, or nippers. Glass tiles are also very popular in kitchens. They come in a variety of colors and shapes. You can either get translucent or transparent. A lot of them are going to have a color underneath it on the backing. And
That's interesting.
So they're very bright. They really look very reflective and very easy to clean. Stone tiles come flat or textured. There's different thicknesses, and you can get mosaics, so you can get a variety of shapes on a mesh backing.
Right.
And with the stone, you want to make sure that you're intermixing the boxes because of the natural differences in coloration and texture. So if you have one box, it could be very similar in color, and then the next box could be a completely different shade. So you wouldn't want to start with like light going to dark. You'd want to make sure you intermix all your boxes.
That's your intent.
Right.
That's the look you're going for.
And some designers with stone, they use stone over the countertops, and then over the stove itself, they use a different type or just a flat ceramic, and that way you're blending a couple textures, and then you have the easy to clean stuff over the stove, and then
Because I'll tell you, I made sauce the other day, spaghetti sauce, and it was a pain to clean off the wall because I don't have a backsplash.
And like with that, you want to check to see if this stone needs to be sealed or what type of sealer is recommended, because some of this can be porous. So and some of it with texture, isn't the best choice for over your stove. You can get metallic tile made out of aluminum, bronze, stainless steel, copper, a variety of different types of metal.
I've never heard of this.
A lot of these are self-stick, so they have an adhesive on it. Some don't require grout, so kind of easy to install. But look at the installation guidelines when you're thinking about if you like this look of metal, because some can be cut, they're very thin, they can be cut with a utility knife, but some require a chop saw.
Wow.
And then if you're using a chop...
That's a big difference.
Yeah, and if you use a chop saw, you need to sand the edges with either sandpaper or a polishing stone.
What do you mean by chop saw?
So it's a circular saw on a platform that you pull down on your material. So, like a miter saw.
Okay.
And like some of the metal wall tiles that are self-stick, there's a variety of other peel and stick wall tiles, either 12-inch by 12-inch solid, or you have a 12-inch by 12-inch mosaic. So it has multiple small pieces in that.
Have you ever used this?
Never used them, but I saw some of the styles, and they have some thickness to them and density. Some are gel, and so very reflective. They kind of look like glass.
Because I've used like peel and stick floor tiles
and
before.
very similar, very easy.
Right.
You don't have adhesives to put on the wall. Some of these don't require grout. So if you want to change the look of your kitchen or create a backsplash easily, these peel and stick do a nice job. 2 of the highest rated. One was Smart Tiles, and the other one is Crystiles. So it's Crystiles, and many of them can be either cut with knives or scissors, but some do need a chop saw, so make sure you read the guidelines before you get it. And many of these are going to have pressure-sensitive glue, so you can lightly push it against the wall, and it'll just hold in place so you can see your spacing, and then when you want it to sit permanently, you're going to use like a rubber grout float and push it firmly, and then it releases that glue and it really sticks.
Interesting.
For standard tile, you're going to be either using a thin set mortar or a mastic. And thin set mortar is a cement-based adhesive, and this is designed to hold the tiles in a very thin layer, usually 3/16 or less. And you apply this to the wall. You're going to spread it with a notch trowel, and that's going to leave a uniform amount depending on the size of your tile. And you're either going to be using a square notch or a V notch. Usually a 1/4 inch square notch is for tile larger than 6-inch by 6-inch. And then for smaller tiles, 5/32 deep by 3/16 wide in a V shape is going to be used. But make sure you're checking your installation instructions on your tile, because you really need to match the amount of adhesive on the wall to the tile. And these thin set mortars are going to come in different formulas depending on the tile and the location. So make sure you're matching that to your project also. And this is going to come like a dry powder in a bag. You're going to have to add water to it and mix it.
So like when you throw out these measurements, like 5/16, 3/8,
exactly.
Whatever. I mean, does anybody know how much that is?
Well, that's the beauty about matching your tile and your notch trowel, because that shape, as you trowel it over the adhesive that you put on the wall, it's going to measure it exactly for you. So you're going to pull your trowel at like a 45-degree angle, and it's going to pull off all the excess and just leave the right amount. So 3/16.
As long as you're using the right tool, you should be okay.
Yes. When you're mixing your thin set, you want to get a bucket and a drill and a mixing paddle, and that's going to mix it the easiest and the fastest. You can do it by hand, but it takes twice as long. And then be careful with your drill, though. If you have an underpowered drill, if you're mixing a large batch of mortar, it can actually overheat or overload like a light-duty drill. And so if you hear the RPMs starting to really slow down substantially on your drill, then I would either use a bigger drill or just do it by hand. And whenever you're mixing these powders, I would either wear a dust mask like an N95, a respirator, and make sure you wear goggles. Pour your water in first, and then use exact measurements. You're going to measure out exactly your dry mortar, add it to the bucket, and then use a drill on slow speed so you're mixing it thoroughly. If you mix it too fast, you can actually trap air bubbles in the mix. Most pros recommend that you mix this for at least a full 5 minutes with your paddle. If you're doing it by hand, a lot of the pros are saying mix it twice as long.
Wow.
And it should end up with the consistency of either peanut butter or toothpaste.
So kind of thick.
Right. And then you want to let it set for 10 minutes, and they call this slaking or slacking, so different people call it different things. But it needs to completely absorb the moisture into this dry mix. So they want you to just let it set for about 10 minutes, and the water's going to move through it. If you want to use a pre-mixed adhesive, you'd go with the mastics. So for some tiles, and these are formulated to be sticky for wall projects, where thin sets can be used in most locations, either wet or dry, like in a bathroom or a kitchen. Most of the mastics can only be used in dry locations, like a kitchen. Mastics set slower, so it's much easier for beginners. You're not so rushed to get the tiles up. And mastic was originally made from the resin of the mastic tree in Greece.
No.
And the ancient Egyptians used it for the embalming, and in medieval times, mastic was used to freshen the breath and as a tooth whitener.
Wow, exciting.
And the first dentist, they used mastic from this mastic tree to fill cavities. For ceramics, some porcelain tiles, and stone, you can use the mastics, but you need to look at your installation instructions because some stone is moisture sensitive. So like green marble, they want you to use an epoxy adhesive to stick it to the wall. And mastics aren't going to dry properly if the tile is non-porous. So if you're putting up glass tile, you wouldn't want to use a mastic because the mastic needs to air dry. Whereas a thin set, you can basically use on anything because it's a chemical reaction.
Okay.
When you're using a pre-mixed mastic, you want to stir it before you use it, even though it's pre-mixed. Sometimes water will rise to the top. Usually you're going to have about a 30-minute working time, but check your label. If you're doing a project and you've laid out your adhesive in an area and you plan on taking a break or you get called away, make sure that you scrape off all the excess because you don't want that to cure over. And most of the mastics, you're going to have to wait 24 hours before you grout because it needs to cure by air getting to it. If you don't want to work with adhesives that you have to trowel onto your wall, you can get rolls of tile adhesive. So it's like a double-backed tape, basically.
Interesting.
So you can cut the shape you want, you stick it to your wall, you pull off this backing, and you're going to stick your tile right to it. There's one style that was highly rated called Bondera, Bondera, and this uses a pressure-sensitive adhesive on a roll. It's mold-resistant, water-resistant, and it comes in gray. So you put it on your wall, you stick your tiles to it. The problem with it being gray is that they said with some of these transparent glass tiles, it slightly darkens it. So you have to be conscious with that. And then muscle bound, it's Mussel bound, and this is an adhesive mat. And you can use this with any type of tile up from 12 by 12 inches or smaller and up to a ½ inch thick.
Wow.
And you just stick it to the wall, you pull off the backing, and you stick your tiles right to it, and you're done.
Nice.
Once you get your tile up, most tile is going to need grout to fill that space between the tiles. And look at your tiles also. You're going to need spacers for most of them, and there's different sizes. So it's like little plastic X's that you shove between the tiles, and that's going to give you the perfect spacing. Some tiles are going to come with little tabs on the edges, and so it's self-spacing. But when you're grouting, you can either use pre-mixed or you have a dry powder that you're going to mix with water. You want to work in a small area at a time, probably about 3 feet by 3 feet. You're going to work it in with some type of grout float.
What's a float?
So this is a rectangular rubber or foam tool that has a handle on top of it, and this forces the grout in between the tiles, and then it's not going to scratch the top of the tile. And you're going to work it into these lines. You're going to then pull off all the excess. So work diagonally against the joints, pull off all the excess, force it into the joints. You're going to have to check your label.
So do you have to clean the tiles as you're doing them?
Yes, so look at your set time, and then you're going to go back with a large sponge. You're going to wring it in a bucket of water, get all the excess water out of it, and then wipe off the face of your tile. Flip your sponge over, wipe it again, and you're going to be very careful not to remove the grout between the grout lines. And you also don't want this sponge wet. If you get too much moisture into the grout, it's going to weaken it. So just keep working a small area at a time, and then you're going to work over the whole area that you did.
Okay.
And when you're looking at your grout, you're going to see sanded grout and unsanded grout. The sanded is usually for joint lines that are an 1/8 inch to a ½ inch wide, and the unsanded grout is usually for your smaller joints, so less than an 1/8 of an inch. And then for highly polished surfaces too, because the sand can scratch, some surfaces. And then most of these are going to need to be sealed, but check your label. And then there's different types of grouts too. You can get some epoxies and some different things. So the key is look at the instructions.
Reading is good.
And then if you do have to seal it, make sure that you're checking the tile, because some tile you can't get the sealer on the tile because it'll absorb it. So you're going to want to work with a tiny foam brush and just work your grout lines, which is much more tedious.
Yeah, I would say so.
I spoke to Joe Truini, and he had a couple of tips for backsplashes, and he wrote the Stanley book on tiling. And also we spoke to him about building sheds. He's an author of quite a few books. What he likes is back buttering the tile. So for
what does that mean?
Well, for beginners, instead of putting your mastic or your thin set on the wall and then you're cutting your pieces and you're trying to get this done before the adhesive dries.
Right.
He says take each tile and then just put the adhesive on the back of that individual tile and then put it onto your wall. So you're going to use a notch trowel the same way,
right,
but you're just putting it on the back of the tile. You put it in place, and now you can take your time. You can stop at any time, and you're going to get a very good bond. He likes the polymer modified thin sets. He recommends mixing it for at least 5 minutes. Let it slake for 10. If you're using a wet saw, get a tarp and put it underneath it. If you're not working in your garage, always wear safety glasses. And one thing he recommended was a diamond hand pad when you're working with saws, and that's going to smooth the edge and get a 60 grit diamond hand pad.
Interesting.
A few other things to think about. Remove all your switch and outlet covers. I would tape off the devices. I would use painter's tape on top of the countertop and like the upper cabinets, wherever the wall is going to meet them. I would cover that with painter's tape. Cover the countertop with craft paper, cardboard, or drop cloths. If you've done any drywall repair, make sure you sand it smooth and prime it before you put your adhesive on there. And then lay out your tile. If you're going into a corner where two walls meet, you want to make sure that where you're ending, it's not going to be just a sliver that you're going to have to, So a lot of times you're going to find like a middle spot where you want your tile to start, but lay it out on the countertop. If you've got a sink or something in the way, lay it out on the floor. And then make sure you're measuring it. Make sure you're using your spacers if you're going to use a spacer to measure it. And then shift that a little bit if you need to, because it's nice to start at the top of the counter with full pieces, work your way up to the top of the upper cabinet, and then you're going to want your cut pieces underneath there so you're not going to see them.
Right.
And then when you come into the end of a wall, or let's say you're laying it out and it's just on one wall, you don't want slivers on the end, or you don't want one thick piece on one side and one sliver on the other. You want it to be uniform. And then think about the end pieces too. A lot of these tiles, they're going to have a special bullnose tile that has a beveled edge to it so that you can finish it. So include those in your measurements. And sometimes they're thinner than a standard tile. So think about that. If your style that you really like doesn't come with a pre-formed edge like that, so like a beveled edge, then you can either get stone or metal edges in a coordinated color. They have something called pencil molding. It's just this thin, almost the size of a pencil, and it's a shaped molding for the edge of it. But you really need to be thinking about, how this is going to end before you start to lay it out. Some mosaic tiles are going to have all the pieces beveled, so it's going to be very easy to end it. And then some tumbled stone doesn't need an end tile to create a finished edge. Some of the pros suggest using a very thin bead of caulk to finish that style off.
Oh, interesting.
You also want to think where you're going to end the backsplash. A lot of the pros are saying just tile the back wall and don't go onto a small adjoining wall unless the stove is there. So if you have a stove in a corner, then you're going to want to make sure there's tile on both sides for splashes. But if you have the stove in the center, you just want to do the back wall, and it's going to give the best look, and it's much easier to end it. If you're trying to decide where to end that run of tile too, because sometimes your upper cabinets are closer together than the counter, and the counter goes off. And so if you extend the backsplash all the way to the end of the counter, there's like that weird section that goes beyond the upper cabinets.
Right.
So most designers are suggesting stop at the edge of the upper cabinets, and you're going to get a much cleaner look. If your countertop isn't level, you want to start at the lowest end, and you want to trim your pieces working toward the high side. You also want to leave about an 1/8 to a 1/4 inch expansion gap all the way around, and you're going to fill that with caulk. With glass tile, if they're transparent or translucent, you want to make sure that you're using a white thin set because that way it's going to not darken it.
Right, yeah.
And then some pros recommend putting thin set on the wall with a notch trowel, and then add a thin layer on the back of your tiles with the flat edge of a trowel so that you get much better grab.
Right.
And you don't want to put enough on there where it's going to push up, between, especially if you have a mosaic. You don't want it to come up between the tiles.
Right.
But they say that just by adding a little bit to the back, pushing it on firmly and using like the grout float to really work it on, you're going to get your best grab.
Because you don't want some of these falling off.
Right. To cut your tile, you're going to need a tile cutter and a wet saw for most projects. If you're cutting around outlets and switches, a snap or a rail cutter is great for straight cuts, especially on ceramic tile. You're just going to pull this scoring wheel across the tile, and press it with the handle. It has a little foot on the bottom of it, and that's going to split it apart.
Right.
And then usually you're going to use that diamond head pad or some type of smoothing pad, if there's a little rough edge on it. With stone and glass, you're going to need a wet saw for most cuts. And a wet saw is going to cut curves and angles that you wouldn't be able to do with any other tool. Sometimes they have the nippers where it almost looks like pliers, and it's going to pinch together and chip away pieces. But a wet saw just makes it so much easier.
Right.
For mosaic pieces, I would use a wide painter's tape on the top and the bottom. Let's say we're cutting down a 12-inch by 12-inch sheet of mosaic pieces on top of this mesh sheet. I would use painter's tape on the top and the bottom, measured, and the edge of that tape is going to be my line, and that tape is going to hold the pieces from sliding around.
That's
and
nice.
Then you also have a nice line to follow. And with this, I would cut it with the face down and cut it with the backside up on a wet saw.
Interesting.
With the wet saws, it's going to be throwing some water, so I like using it in the garage or a workroom. Like Joe said, if you have to use it in the house, get a tarp.
Right.
and I like, a couple times we've had to do this, I like putting a tarp down first and then put a drop cloth over the top of it.
Interesting.
That way it's going to absorb, and then the tarp's going to protect your flooring.
How does the wet saw work?
So you've got a platform, and under this it has a trough filled with water, and then the blade is either spitting in the water or there's a little tube.
So it's not like hooked up to a hose or anything?
No, you don't have to hook it up to the garden hose. But it definitely sprays water. So make sure you're wearing goggles. And they do a fantastic job. And you can get these pretty inexpensively, especially if you're doing a bunch of projects. And in fact, with wet saws, the highest rated DeWalt, Bosch, and Rigid, these were a little more expensive. And if you're doing a lot of projects, if you're remodeling your home and you're going to be doing flooring with tile and walls and kitchens and bathrooms, it's probably worth it to get something expensive. With the good quality, top-rated, least expensive, Skill and QEP, and I've got one of these QEPs, very inexpensive, and a lot of these I'll hold the tile in my hand. So you lay it for your main cuts, and then you can grab the tile and shape it and get fantastic curves and stuff.
Yeah.
So they just do a great job. Probably around $50.
Really?
You can pick one up. And then with the manual tile cutters, QEP and Ruby, RUBI, were rated very high.
Do you have anything else to add?
I would say when you're measuring, add 10% for all your cuts. And then
measure twice, cut once.
Yeah, and especially with stone, you want to make sure that you're getting it from the same lot if possible. And you can ask the salespeople to help you with that.
Well, if you're using multiple boxes, make sure you open them all.
Open them and intermix them. Absolutely. You want to match the adhesive to the tile type. You want to work in small areas at a time. With the pre-mix mastic, it's easy. It's a little slower drying, but you can't use it on non-porous tile.
Right.
With the thin set mortar, I would get latex modified. Make sure you're mixing it exactly. And then the adhesive mats are really easy if you want to install it without having to...
Yeah, I'd like to try this. It sounds cool.
Yeah. Lay out your tile before you start. You want full pieces on the bottom and the finished end. If you have to cut pieces, I would make sure that I'm doing most of my cuts under the upper cabinets or in the corners. Make sure that you adjust this so you don't have slivers on the edge. You want, a nice looking size. And then think about your finished edge. You want to add a bevel tile or some type of molding to the end of it. And then, if this just seems overwhelming, get the peel and stick and forget it.
Let's wrap this up.
You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, the Spotify mobile app, Google Play Music app, or iHeartRadio.
If you enjoyed it, please leave us a review.
You can check out our home improvement videos on our YouTube channel, Fix It Home Improvement.
And you can subscribe to that as well.
You can download our books, Home Improvement Solutions, What Every Homeowner Should Know, on Amazon.
If you enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star rating and review.
You can email us at fixitpodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you for listening.
Talk to you next week.